Hello, everybody. Good afternoon for people in Europe and good morning for the people that are logging in North America. Hi, and welcome to this new webinar of Iceberg Data Lab. It's our monthly webinar, and this month it's a very special one because we have the pleasure to welcome Thomas Giroux from Mirova. Hi, Thomas.
Hello, everyone.
Hi. So we're very excited about this webinar because Thomas will be our guest today, and Thomas, you have a very special profile because on the one hand, you're a portfolio manager at Mirova in charge of the thematic funds and the environmental funds. And on the other hand, you are a researcher, a PhD student, and you have just published a very interesting academic research for us because it deals with the biodiversity premium in the financial market. So that will be the topic of our discussion today. Sorry, Thomas, I forgot to say that you were as well the co-head of the Mirova Research Center, which is a big part of your activities. So today we're going to talk about this paper. We're going to talk about your findings, Thomas, and how the financial market value the biodiversity risk premium. First of all, is there a biodiversity risk premium? And we'll try to look how can portfolio manager or investment professionals navigate, how they can navigate into this risk and maybe spot investment opportunities. So for this, I have as well with us today Clément, who works at Iceberg and who is in charge of our main indicator, which is the corporate biodiversity footprint. Hi, Clément.
Hello.
So, Thomas, in your research, you have been using our product from Iceberg, the CBF, the Corporate Biodiversity Footprint, for your study. So that's why today we will start, after this brief introduction, I will hand over to Clément, who will tell you what is the CBF, how we compute it, how it is measured, and how you can use it if you are researchers or investment professionals. And then we'll move to the findings of Thomas. So, as a quick introduction, Iceberg Data Lab, we were founded 5 years ago now. We're not a startup anymore, we are a scale-up now. We have an expertise in terms of environmental impact. We calculate corporate environmental impact for listed company mostly, but we do as well calculate it for private companies. And we were created 5 years ago with a very strong scientific committee, and we are based on science. We pride ourselves to be based on science and to have very close link with the academical world. So that's our expertise. We calculate environmental impact of companies on the environment, on climate. That's one thing that we do, and biodiversity is our expertise. We have developed a very granular model, including 2,300 goods and services. We created a sub-level of the NACE nomenclature that we call NACE 5. It goes until up to the fourth level usually, but we developed the fifth one. And thanks to this very detailed model, we are able to produce scope 3 data on climate and biodiversity for all the companies that we have in our universe. So scope 3 upstream and downstream data. We can provide that for climate and for biodiversity impact. Finally, our coverage today in terms of listed issuers is around 8,500 companies, and it's growing every month because we keep improving the model with our team of analysts as well. Iceberg is this balance between the model that is our force, but as well we have a strong team of sectoral analysts that are in charge of fine-tuning the model. This is what we offer at Iceberg. On the left, climate data. On the right, biodiversity data. So climate, we are less known for that, but of course we produce carbon footprint, 2-degree alignment, avoided emissions. And today we will focus on biodiversity, where you can see our main product is written there, the CBF. Later, we'll talk in other webinars, we will talk about deforestation that we have just released. So deforestation impact, CBF scores, positive contribution. We have plenty of other things in biodiversity, but today we will focus on the CBF that Thomas Giroux has used for his research paper. Finally, why do our clients use Iceberg Data? Our client uses for regulatory reporting, EU taxonomy, TNFD, Article 29 in France, or SFDR reporting, and for which use case to do selection, exclusion, risk monitoring, portfolio monitoring, calculate the biodiversity or the carbon footprint of their portfolio, and do the reporting. Or banks come to us to create specific ETFs or indices. So, Clément, can you tell us a bit more about the CBF and how we compute it at Iceberg?
Of course. So my section is going to be focused on explaining the technicalities and methodological aspects that are required to understand and grasp better what the CBF means, what it includes, and how to use it. So the output of the corporate biodiversity footprint is the biodiversity impact generated by the activities of a company during 1 year. It's expressed in square per unit of MSA, which is biodiversity equivalent surface loss. The final impact accounts for impacts generated from several environmental pressures, as well as impacts occurring along the value chain of a given activity. Just like GHG emissions, it's an absolute metric, meaning that the bigger the company, usually the bigger the footprint. And so in order to correct this size bias, we also provide the result in financial intensities with different financial KPIs available. We also have data quality levels associated to each data point, since the primary data that we use to compute the final impact isn't always as accurate. The MSA metric, which is the biodiversity metric used by the CBF, is a metric that measures the intactness of ecosystems. It ranges from 1 to 0% to 100%, 100% being undisturbed, pristine biodiversity state, and 0% being a basically. It was developed by PBL, which is the Netherlands Environmental Agency, and this MSA metric has been featured in different publications in international organizations such as the Convention on Biological Diversity or some of the IPBES works. This slide is just meant to provide more depth and perspective as to where the MSA stands in comparison to other possible biodiversity metrics. We know that there are 3 levels of biodiversity: genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecosystem diversity. And so to each of these different levels correspond different metrics, or possible metrics of genetic composition, and so on and so on. It's just to really emphasize that the MSA looks at the collective diversity of organisms. And so broadly speaking, it looks at community composition. Now in terms of coverage, what is included in the results? So first, coverage in terms of pressures. So on this slide, on the left-hand side, you have the IPBES impact driver framework that identified the 5 main impact drivers of biodiversity loss: land use, pollution, climate change, overexploitation, and invasive species. And so you have on the right-hand side of the table the corresponding approach framework that we follow at Iceberg Data Lab to granularize the approach. And so, for instance, we cover and distinguish within land use, occupation, transformation, fragmentation that has more to do with linear infrastructure, while encroachment has to do with non-linear. And now in terms of coverage, in terms of value chain, when we compute the footprints starts by default with financial data. So we use revenues that we disaggregate by activity and by country. We have a very granular activity classification nomenclature. And so in all these activities, with the revenues disaggregated, we model flows of goods and services that we call commodities in production and consumption. And that's thanks to this modeling of what's in consumption that we managed to assess the scope 3 upstream. It's worth mentioning that by default, everything is modeled from revenues because this is the consistent data source that we have to ensure that the database is trackless. But we have an analyst team that goes through annual reports and collects company-specific data, whether it is revenue data, sector data, or quantities of goods and services, or reported pressures.
Thank you, Clément. So we understand how the CBF, what it is and how it is calculated. Now we'll hand over to Thomas, who will tell us about his main findings. By the way, I forgot, there will be a Q&A at the end, so feel free to ask questions in the question box on the right-hand side corner. If you have questions on the CDF or if you have questions during Thomas' presentation.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to present our research. This is a joint project with two other researchers from NCA Paris and EM Business School in Lille. Well, I'm sure everyone is already aware of the urgency to address the biodiversity crisis, but I would just like to stress a few points. First, nature and biodiversity provide ecosystem services, as we mentioned, which are really valuable input to our global economies. The World Bank estimates that over 50% of the world GDP, either directly or indirectly, depends on it. And the problem with the ecosystem services is that they are, in an economic sense, public goods, meaning that their consumption is non-rival and available to everyone, even those that are not really willing to pay for it. We know that with such goods, the main implication is that it is very likely to be undervalued and underpriced in our society, which is one of the reasons why we are facing such a crisis today, similarly to what we are facing with climate change. Luckily, there has been some increasing awareness over the past decades. First, at the government level, I think one of the biggest events was the COP15 on biodiversity in 2022. And this has also turned into actions at the corporate level and investors level. There has been the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure and the Finance for Biodiversity Pledge, for instance, which shows that investors are becoming more aware of the biodiversity. It's not only risk, but the biodiversity theme. And this is one of the reasons why it could be priced in the market. There are specific reasons. First, it's financial risk. We can think about physical risk, which is related to companies' business model dependency on ecosystem services, and then regulatory and reputational risk, which are directly related to the company biodiversity footprint. There is also another reason which may introduce biodiversity risk premium, which is the tilt toward low impact companies by some concerned investors or impact investors. And those are the reason why it is interesting from an academic perspective, but also from a practitioner, an investor perspective, to see whether the market is pricing biodiversity risk and how it is being done. And this is what we try to do with this study. When we began this study in 2022, 2023, there wasn't much in the literature, but now there are a bit more papers and at least two who study a similar question. One from Alexandre Garel and its co-authors, and they actually also use the corporate biodiversity footprint as the main metric in their study. And the other one is from Stefano Giglio and its co-authors. Pretty much what they find is that biodiversity risk or opportunities, whatever, it hasn't been priced in the market in the past 10 years, let's say. However, recently, especially after the TNFD announcement and the COP15 on biodiversity, the market seems to have begun to price biodiversity risk. Now, in this study, we contribute to the literature in several ways. First, we do not only look at realized returns, unlike in the other two papers, but also at expected returns to have something about a forward-looking materiality notion. Then we also differentiate between highly exposed versus low exposed industries in the double materiality sense, meaning that we do not only look at the impact of companies at the industry level on biodiversity, but we also include the dependencies of companies at the industry level on the ecosystem services. And finally, we apply a time series analysis, which allow us to see whether there has been a biodiversity risk premium and how it has evolved over time, which helps us trying to understand what are the determinants for it. I won't explain what is the CBF again, because Clément does that a lot better than I would. But in the paper, we had to explain a lot what is the CBF and what it aims to capture, because the academic field and community are not really used to it yet. So I would just like to take one of the charts that we made, and it compares, or it draws the correlation between the CBF and some publicly available metrics or list of companies. And what we find is a negative correlation because the CBF is a negative metric, but a significant correlation between the CBF and some of the other methodologies that are publicly available. So it's a first result that shows more, that brings more confidence into using this metric from an academic perspective. And maybe another figure to illustrate this, among the WBA nature list, that's the World Benchmark Alliance nature list, 70% of the companies from this list belong to the top 20% of the companies with the highest corporate biodiversity footprint in our sample. So this is highly coherent and relevant. Now, what we do as researcher in asset pricing when we have a new risk feature is that we try to see whether it is explained by traditional risk factors or not. So in order to do this, we build what we call a mimicking portfolio, where we go long on companies that are that have a limited biodiversity footprint, let's say, and short on companies with higher biodiversity footprint. And then we try to explain the performance of this portfolio against the traditional risk factors, and we also added the carbon risk factor to take into account the climate dimension. And what we see is that, at least at the aggregated level, there seems to be something that is not entirely explained by traditional risk factors. It's not spanned by traditional risk factors. So something significant and specific to biodiversity itself. Hence, the next question is, does biodiversity alone explain part of the cross-section of the returns? And this is what we do in the following section of the paper. So to do this, we rely on the very traditional FAMAMAC-based regression. This is an old one and a simple one, but it has the good thing that it allows us to derive the time series of the risk premium, which we can then analyze. So again, when doing this, we differentiate between realized and expected returns and between low and high materiality industries. What we find is that on the overall market over 10 years, there wasn't any significant risk premium associated with biodiversity. However, when we turn the focus to high exposed industries, so industries with high impact on biodiversity and high dependencies on biodiversity, the ones that are more subject to risk, and then we find a significant risk premium for biodiversity, especially when we look at expected returns, which means that companies with higher biodiversity in those industries would have to compensate investors for taking the risk associated with their biodiversity footprint or dependence. Now, as I mentioned, the next thing is to look at the dynamic of the risk premium and try to understand it. The first thing that we observe is that the materiality of the risk premium really increased in 2021 and 2022. And this is highly, this supports previous findings in the literature. So this is a smooth version of the dynamic. Of course, there are more variations, which we try to explain with exogenous variables. On the next slide.
Sorry.
That's fine. Yeah, this one.
Sorry.
So, okay, so the previous one, Thomas. So,
sorry.
Yeah, this one. So what we try to do here is to see what drives the dynamic of the risk premium. And what we observe, so of course, we take into account some time series part of the dynamic for the one that would be interested in the model, but then we also add exogenous variables. And what we see is that when biodiversity attention increases or when risk aversion increases, this tends to reinforce the risk premium associated with biodiversity. On the contrary, when consumer sentiment improves, so when people are more positive about the future, then it tends to reduce the risk premium. One interesting thing is also that we observe that when climate attention increases, it also tends to reduce the risk premium associated with biodiversity. And the way I would interpret this is that still today, investors tend to look at biodiversity and climate in two different silos, and they do not necessarily fully capture how intertwined those two thematics are. And probably there is also still an emphasis that is put on climate versus biodiversity. So now, as any academic work, there are limitations in the data that we use, in the modeling, and rooms for improvement. So a few of those limits and suggestions for future work. The CBF is a great tool. However, it is not perfect. It's really not to criticize the CBF. It's a great tool. But for instance, it only looks at biodiversity on land and not marine biodiversity. Also, it's dependent on data availability that is disclosed by company. It doesn't, similarly to carbon footprint, for instance, it looks backward. It doesn't give you any insights on whether the company will have a credible transition plan, for instance, to address the challenges related to biodiversity, nor does it give you any insights on the solution providers, for instance. So trying to use alternative data to better understand how the market prices biodiversity, complete this analysis would make sense. And another suggestion that we had is to use investors' preferences through what we call preferences revelation instead of just security prices to better understand when do investors take some action regarding biodiversity. Thank you.
That was very interesting. So I think now our audience understand that there is a biodiversity risk premium and how we see it appearing and being valued in the market. So thank you very much. That was extremely interesting, and we'll move to the questions. So please ask all your questions and we'll answer them right now. We'll start with Bien, who asked at the very beginning, what was, Thomas, your definition of ecosystem services?
I don't have my own definition of ecosystem services. I think the IPBS has one. I know there are 26 of them. Clément might know them by heart. You can say me.
But yes, I guess the official definition is benefit society derives from nature in whatever form, and usually they are categorized in 3 groups: provisioning services, which have a use value that we consume directly, regulating services, which we do not consume directly, but are more linked to, for instance, climate regulation, water buffering, things like that, and then cultural services that are harder to grasp, but that, give a sense of place, spirituality, educational purposes, and so on.
Thank you, Clément.
Thanks.
Then the second question. Sorry, Thomas, you wanted to add something?
No, ready. Thank you, Clément.
So the second question is a question about the different providers, MSCI, Bloomberg, and others. So Shuang is curious to know, how does the E-score, our score basically, how does it differ? I think I might take this question because actually I joined Iceberg last year and I used to work for Bloomberg at 9. The first thing I would say is that Iceberg Data Lab, we are not a financial data provider. That's not what we do. Bloomberg, MSCI, they are financial data provider, first of all, and they developed an ESG data offering recently because it was interesting to develop one. What I would like to say is that Mathieu, our founder, used to work at BNP Paribas in France, and he was head of sustainability. He was using those providers, and it's using their data that he realized that he had to build something. He started to build it internally to have an accurate and granular data, scientifically backed, which is not the case of our competitors. And then he just decided, he saw the opportunity and spin off and created his own company. So yeah, what I would like to say is that we are experts of environmental data. That's all what we do. We are scientifically backed. We have a scientific committee that meets every month with plenty of well-known actors. We have a steering committee with our clients as well, very close to our clients. Our model is not a black box. Like, we talk about it, we explain it, we show how it works, which is not the case of our competitors. And last thing I would say, the proximity of our client, because we're a young company, we are a startup, we're very close to our clients who really care, let's say, about environmental impact. Bloomberg has a very strong offering on financial data and other things. It's MSCI too. They are great companies, but I doubt they are experts like we are, because all we do is that. biodiversity and climate.
I could add from a scientific perspective that using data where you know how it has been computed and having access to very granular data points, like here we're only talking about the CBF, but we had access to every pressure that is used to compute the CBF with the methodology linked to it. This was something that is really important as an academic to understand what you're using and whether it does make sense from a scientific perspective or not.
So please ask your last questions because we're approaching from the end of the session. But Thomas, I had one so thank you for your research. It's extremely interesting to see research on biodiversity being published. But it's one of the first one. There has been just a few. You mentioned them in your presentation. My question would be: is the scientific community taking this topic seriously now, and what do you think of it, of this new topic?
Well, yes, the scientific community is now taking this very seriously. There has been several calls for research over the past 2-3 years, and there are now actually new working papers on this topic on dependencies, for instance, but also there is a survey that was published recently by Zacharias Sotner and its co-authors on how companies view biodiversity as a risk. So a lot is being done at the moment. There are also special issues that are being edited by top-tier journals on biodiversity finance. And finally, it does not only look at listed assets, but there are also studies on private assets. And I know this because I happen to have written one recently as well.
Perfect. Guys, this is the end of this webinar. Thank you so much, Thomas, for coming here. Clément, thank you as well. Thank you to everybody who came. If you're a researcher and you would like to have access to our data or to be put in contact with Thomas Giroux, please come to us. If you are an investment professional and you would like to have an idea of the biodiversity impact of your portfolio, please come to us. You will all receive an email from us with a replay, so you just have to answer to it. Otherwise, I'll see you next month for the next webinar. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.